Let's move straight down the line to Clive.
Okay, thank you. And thank you for that fascinating and stimulating talk, Jonathan. I've forgotten how stimulating it is to hear you. I just wanted to make 5 points to kind of flesh out some dimensions of that and to add to it perhaps a little. My first one is that in landscapes, small things matter. And I wanted to illustrate that using this leaf, which I raked up from the garden at the weekend, from an apple tree in the garden. The autumn colours are just beginning to fade in Perthshire, but they never fail to inspire. But there's much more to leaves than fantastic landscapes. And to add to the kind of time scale, when leaves evolved around 380 million years or so ago, they changed the course of animal and plant evolution. They made flowering plants possible. That's quite impressive in its own right, but they also set in train carbon cycles and water cycles as we currently know them, regulating energy flows between the land and the atmosphere, and influencing local and global climates. So that's not bad for a leaf, really. In this leaf, then, we can recognise the 4 main ecosystem services that Fiona's already alluded to. Provisioning services in fruit and timber, supporting services in soil formation and processes, and photosynthesis, of course, regulating services in water, climate, carbon and water cycles and climate, and cultural services in inspirational landscapes that people enjoy, and their memories and associations all come together in as well. So small things matter. And that feeds into my second point, which is about placemaking, how all the elements of a place come together, including the people who live in it. And if we want to conserve energy, water, and other resources for all the reasons that Jonathan's already alluded to, that has to start at the small scale, working with the grain of the local environment and landscape in the buildings, and applying that at subsequent scales through villages, urban regeneration, and at the regional or landscape scale as well. And so landscapes and placemaking has to be managed actively at all of those scales, and that presents a really big governance challenge, and Jonathan's kind of painted a fairly gloomy prospect for that, I think, because how the public sector relates to the private sector markets and communities is fundamental towards creating good places. My third point then is about landscape quality and where placemaking has gone badly wrong. And using the example of parts of Glasgow, some of the deprived communities there, which are very much associated with hugely degraded local environments and landscapes, and very acute physical and mental health problems. And in some parts of Glasgow, average male life expectancy is just 53 years, which is an astonishing statistic, really. Physical and mental health problems, there's increasing evidence that they interact in different ways, and much of that has to do with the sense of hopelessness that individuals feel about their situation. And of course, lots of things affect that, but a common factor seems to be the quality of the local environment and landscape, certainly in the West of Scotland area. My fourth point then is about placemaking in a wider context, and it seems to me that landscapes have something of Oscar Wilde's picture of Dorian Gray about them, in the sense that many of our landscapes are quite stunning, seemingly eternally beautiful, but actually we leave some very ugly scars on landscapes and ecosystems overseas through the raw resources that we consume to support our consumption and lifestyles. So, I think landscapes then are hugely important in terms of what they tell us about our values, what we value about people who live in those landscapes, our use of resources, tangible and intangible resources, near and far, and how much that matters to us as a society. And just as climate change can be looked at as a measure of an unsustainable society, so I think can degraded landscapes. One of the problems there is that landscapes tend to change very slowly, or perhaps more importantly, we quite quickly learn to live with that change. And as Joni Mitchell said, don't it always seem to go that you don't know what you've got till it's gone? Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Clive. Very pleased that you've introduced that subject of buildings and communities, and we'll come back to that again, but thank you for that. Neil.
Thanks, yeah. Just a couple of points from me, really. I'm trying to pick up the challenge, I think, the gauntlet that Jonathan threw down to CPRE in relation to planning. I think I agree in large part with much of what you were saying about the current situation in terms of what we know about the government's proposals for planning reform. There are some serious challenges that we're going to face when the bill is published very soon, and when we get to debate not just what sustainable development might mean in terms of a presumption in favour of, but also what the national planning framework might say in terms of guiding the localism agenda on the ground. Because I don't agree necessarily with Jonathan that we're going to see nothing between the centre and localism. And CPRE is already engaging in discussions with officials and ministers about quite how the national planning framework might help steer decisions in the right direction. But for CPRE, and I'm sure for many other people in this room, the planning system has for many years been a critical means of reconciling these tensions between environmental and economic objectives, between different environmental objectives, reconciling long and short-term agendas. And I think the environmental role of planning has, for us, been neglected far too much in recent years. I think I would agree, with Jonathan's frustration with the Foresight report, but one of the things I think it did do quite helpfully was bring a focus to bear on questions to do with the governance of the land use system. It didn't quite go as far as CPRE would have liked. We were involved in that study, but I very much hope that the new government is looking at elements of that report and looking at the way in which it was framing questions about the governance of land use, and that it applies that an understanding of those issues to planning reform, which is, as I say, coming down the road very quickly. I think clearly there are risks here from the localism agenda. CPRE, I think, is as concerned as Jonathan might be about the possibility of the short-term interests of existing communities trumping the long-term interests of future generations in terms of land use decisions. But like Fiona, I think we would agree that there is a case for rebalancing the system. We were seeing too much top-down decision-making, I think, in recent years. And so there are opportunities in the localism agenda as well as risks. I would say that CPRE, perhaps alone amongst many environmental NGOs, has drawn attention to some of the risks very recently in a report that we produced called The Bigger Picture. There are certainly risks, not just in terms of the new environmental challenges that we're facing, but also in terms of our traditional environmental agendas. The role of greenbelt policy has been so successful in recent years, I think, precisely because it's been effectively enforced nationally. And we're very concerned at the possibility or the fact, it seems, of ministers withdrawing from decisions to call in developments that are threatening important parts of the greenbelt. But I would say, in terms of planning reform, the bigger risk is that we might see the planning system almost denuded to the extent that we will see the emergence of a significant shift towards a laissez-faire approach. I think that we will be looking very closely to ensure that there is coherence in the government's planning reform proposals so that we can address some of the long-term land use challenges that Jonathan's drawn attention to. The second issue I just wanted to pick up on was this issue of competing environmental objectives. And it seems to me wrong to suggest that landscape concerns, perhaps traditional landscape concerns, should always be in conflict with the need to take effective action to tackle some of the newer challenges of climate change, food security, demographic pressures and so on that Jonathan's talked about. To put it bluntly, we would argue that there's no need to trash the countryside to save the environment. And I think, to come back to the thrust of what Fiona was saying, we need to start from a position of recognising legitimate concerns about environmental quality, about issues like beauty, about issues like tranquility, and we're delighted that we've been able to work with Linda's and colleagues on issues to do with tranquility and urban intrusion over recent years, issues to do with local distinctiveness, which Fiona mentioned. It's important that we link those concerns with newer concerns in order to build consensus around the need for effective action to tackle the environmental challenges we face. And it's here that we're hopeful, perhaps naively hopeful, that the government's commitment to producing a natural environment white paper may give us an opportunity to achieve this linkage of environmental concerns, to pursue in tandem what some argue are conflicting environmental objectives, and to ensure that the Natural Environment White Paper, which the government's committed to producing early in the new year, actually has a read across to the planning reform agenda as well, so that we're seeing these two debates being pursued along parallel or mutually reinforcing tracks.
Thank you very much indeed, Neil. That reference to tranquility, I'm sure, is going to come back in again later in the discussion.